Good. I'm going to speak a little bit more extemporaneously than some of the others. There is a PowerPoint, but I'm going to also use this chance to bring in some of the themes that I think have been introduced to the other ones and see if I can start a conversation across them. But I do want to say something about the background and where this project fits. The first image is clearly the happy image. And when I started the project, for this particular group, the contrast between the good and the happy. And of course, the good and the happy is a long discussion philosophically, and less so, I think, for researchers. And one of the starting points of this project that Becky didn't flash particularly, I think, in her excellent overview, was a dissatisfaction that many of us have with the survey research mode, in which happiness is generally a response to a single question. On a scale of 0 to 10, tell us how happy you are. That's generally what it is. And then there's the second question, generally how satisfied you are with your life. And so these two words, happy and satisfied, are used in English as if they were one thing, although we know, of course, they aren't one thing. And for those of us, and several people in this room, Marty and Yanjie, and there may be others, but those are the two I've worked with in my experience, we know that translating these questions will be quite complicated. And that when you're doing a survey, that's what people are responding to, this word. Are you 高兴? Are you 快乐? Whatever it is. And those are different. In work I've been doing with a large urban survey, which we did in 2011, and we've done then subsequent follow-up, mainly looking at the difference between migrants and non-migrants in a representative sample of urban China. We felt that satisfaction was probably the stronger question. And so you ask people, in general, with your life now, how satisfied? You can also ask how satisfied you are, other things. And it is fairly robust. However, when you ask how happy you are, you get different results, and they do not map. Those two questions do not produce the same results. So this was sort of the beginning of where we were, which was, we're going to take this question of happiness very, very seriously. And then that quickly led us down a path towards ethnographic work, which is really not about happiness as much as it is the good life. What does it mean to have a good life, and how does one live a good life? And this is where I'm picking it up in my own presentation. So what is a good marriage, right? A good marriage tends to be one where you have performed certain roles. You have been a good parent, you've been a good provider, you've been a good person in the society, and it could vary, but that's a good marriage. A happy marriage brings in a question usually of the emotional satisfaction of the two principal parties, the man and a woman. We're assuming a heterosexual marriage here. And if we look at what's happened in Chinese law, even starting with the marriage law in the 50s, but particularly since 1980, there is a lot of emphasis on emotional satisfaction. So now, when one talks about what is a happy marriage, and using English now to talk about a Chinese phenomena, that's what I'm probing. And what I'm going to talk about today is a small piece of a larger project, and the main contribution that I'm making to this group project, looking at the wedding. Every marriage has some kind of wedding, and how is it being celebrated? And in that context, asking, is it happy? And then I have various ways that I pursue that, and I'll share with you some of my initial findings. But before I talk about marriage and happiness, weddings and happiness, I just want to introduce a few background comments on the importance of marriage in Chinese society. And that addresses another issue which we discussed at lunch. What is so special about China, or are there characteristics specifically that would set the Chinese experience apart from others? And in general, this is not the way my own thinking and my own work goes. However, in the case of this marriage piece, China does have a distinctive profile, distinctive from its past and distinctive from many other parts of the world. So I just quickly want to explain what those distinctions are. And the first is this enormous increase, and these are numbers of marriages. So the top one is just the number of marriages in all of China, and then in Shanghai, it's that's it, the number of marriages registered in Shanghai. And we know, of course, that many, many people who are living in Shanghai have their marriages registered elsewhere. This talk is not about these issues of counting, because what it does capture is the phenomena that, and here we have the numbers again registered in Shanghai, marriages versus divorces, which is that there's enormous variation from year to year. That early spike is the catch-up from the Cultural Revolution, the people who returned to Shanghai who had postpone their marriages and then rush into marriage. So there's this huge surge. There's also a baby boom piece that's pushing it. Then you're past the baby boom, you're past the return of the countryside group, and it levels out. Then there are other peaks and valleys, but it continues the upward move. And that is partly driven by the migration. That is, some of these people who are included here are people who are registering their marriages in Shanghai, because as the rules change, you can register your marriage more freely. You do not need to go back to your hometown or your home county. The other piece of this is the red part, in which I've written a fair amount, and that's about divorce. I think everyone in this room is generally extremely informed on China, but I do want to remind even those people. In 1980, when the marriage law was rewritten, it made divorce easier. In some ways, but the real turning point is 2003, when they dropped the regulation that to marry or divorce you needed to have the approval of the village head or of your employer, both parties, both the wife and the husband's employer. And as soon as that regulation was in place, the number of divorces surges. So that surge you see, and then it keeps climbing up, is definitely a response to the fact that right now China may be the easiest, cheapest, and quickest place to get a divorce. And that is also meaning that marriages are increasingly fragile. On the other hand, this is one of the points that the introduction to the paper emphasizes, the institution of marriage is very robust. So that while we see a major retreat from marriage across Northern Europe, across North America, and also in Latin America. In fact, in Latin America, the number of marriage is a relatively weak institution, and many people, long-term couples, short-term couples, are certainly forming families, but marriage is not essential to the foundation of a family. And this is, needless to say, not the case in East Asia or in South Asia. Southeast Asia is slightly different. So China is a special place in that almost everyone still marries before the age of 35, so it's what we would call a system of universal marriage, although there's a slight possibility that things will change maybe in the next 10 years. Divorce is very easy. One off the cuff, it's not precise, but in the large cities we would say 1/3 of marriages fail. And I say off the cuff because what you actually have to do is have survey data where you'd have the history of the marriages, when they married and when they divorced. And I thought I was going to get this data and had worked out this great survey. And then I discovered that the information that I needed, which was the year of marriage and the year of the divorce, was in the applications for the divorces, but not in the granting of the divorces. So we cannot know how long people are married, therefore we can't do survival rates for people married in a certain year. So the rough one is how many marriages, how many divorces among the married persons registered in each year. And in that context, urban China looks like the United States. Now the United States looks the way we do because fewer and fewer people are marrying, and you can't divorce unless you marry. So this makes comparison sometimes a little bit difficult. But the overall impression, I think, is quite well supported, which is about 1 in 3 marriages will fail. Moreover, that's how people looking at their upcoming marriage of the decision also look at it. The reason I put this table up is you can see in Shanghai now 20% of persons who married recently had been married before. And this is not primarily widows and widowers marrying. These are not late late life marriages. These are people marrying, divorcing generally between 5 and 7 years of marriage, and in some cases it's more U-shaped. These are not examples, as the Chinese media would say, marry in the morning, divorce in the afternoon. This is not the example that people were very infatuated with 2 years ago, where people to buy a second property, married in the morning, got divorced in the morning, went and bought the new house and remarried. No, that got a lot of attention, but that's not what's driving these longer term patterns you see here. The basic takeaway for the larger context in which we're going to talk about weddings is that marriage, and as several people have already mentioned, is really non-negotiable. If you're going to be an adult, you're going to be married. And in the other piece I'm working on, I have an ethnography of the marriage making corner on matchmaking. It's the common thing will say, I don't care if my child is happy in the marriage, whether this is a good marriage, as long as they can become a parent. So that there's a sense that being a parent is what's absolutely essential. The only way to become a parent is to marry. So the marriage part is fragile in that respect also, in that the relationship between the two spouses is not privileged over this relationship between the next generation and all 3 generations. So against that very quick, and I'm happy to talk more about marriage, I want to talk about wedding ritual, and that's what I think fits with our project. I hadn't expected to focus on ritual and to think about ritual as much when we started our project, but the more I thought about the happy part and performing happiness and the emotional part, and I knew how difficult it was for me to get that kind of material from interviews, oral histories, or survey, I decided what I would do would be focus on the wedding. It's also a happy topic. It's also a topic that both the IRB at Yale was willing to let go through, and also was endorsed by Fudan, which is where I am currently based and will be based for the next 2 years. So that's how I ended up looking at wedding rituals, not because I actually was particularly interested in the wedding itself, that ceremony, but I found that it's been extremely rich. It's allowed me to move with greater freedom than I have ever had in doing fieldwork in China. It has been a topic on which respondents are extremely willing to speak. It's also, as others have noticed, and I will flag at the end, a ceremony which is almost always not just photographed but videoed. And this means that I am able to observe weddings even when I can't attend weddings, although I am attending as many weddings as I can. But the video piece has been really, really important and has made this a much richer experience than I had expected. So very, very quickly, I'm just going to illustrate key rituals that are repeated now in Shanghai, and I would say, from what I am able to know, throughout urban China. I do not think that what you're going to see and what I've discovered is anything particular to this one city. So the first thing is something we all know is very common, and that is the wedding photo. This is not a new ritual. Wedding photos have been popular in East Asia and in China practically since photography was invented, and you had the commercial studios at the turn of the last century, so early 1910s, 20s. We know from Taiwan, Adrian's book and others, some people feel that had a Japanese influence, that it was very, very common for couples to want to celebrate their wedding with a photo, and the photo often is taken before the wedding and then displayed in the family house, so that this captures the couple and then they are memorialized at this moment in their lives. A common practice taken probably maybe directly from Taiwan, but perhaps from Japan beforehand, is the placing of these wedding photographs in the bedroom so that the couple is constantly being observed by their younger selves. So the wedding photo is definitely the first one. The banquet, we all have been to, and we know how lavish they are. Traditionally, before 1949, the banquet was the wedding. In Hong Kong until 1971, the banquet was the wedding. The state did not need to confirm that this wedding was official and that the marriage was official, but by celebrating with your family and their friends before them publicly, the wedding was realized, it was official, and the bride and groom had become husband and wife. Now, what's been added is white gowns. This was something before. Music, Western music. This is not something that was very common. And then most recently, we see things that were not seen in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s. The wedding cakes, the champagne, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of ritual which I have written about elsewhere and extensive notes. This is just a picture which I took off the web. It's from Xi'an. My pictures are not of people, of my interviewees. All the pictures you'll see are pictures that were on promotional materials or online. And so this is one that I think looks like a lot of weddings in China. For those of you who haven't been to a lot of weddings. The last thing, the picture here, is just to remind us that the idea that this is a sweet event, this is a happy event, happy in sweetness, and that the giving of candies by the bride and groom or their parents to people who could not attend the ceremony is very long tradition. But what has happened now is we have custom-made candies. It's become this extraordinary focus of people's attention. And I can talk more about why asking questions about candy and listening to people tell me where they got the money, for who paid what, for what, to give to whom, has been extremely revealing, as Yanjie was referring to in his study of eating out, about the social relationships that are essential for my respondents. So this is just a quick reminder of what the weddings are like. But what I want to talk about very quickly as it relates to the happiness piece is the increased ritualization. So I've just run through quickly different elements of the wedding which are standardized. People virtually never have a wedding without photos, without the banquet, without the white dress, excuse me, without the runway, and without giving candies. But I'm going to talk about two ceremonies that are newer. That is, they're not completely invented, but they are ceremonies that my respondents from urban areas told me they did not perform in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, or even before 1995. So what's fascinating to me is how two ceremonies, which I will very briefly illustrate, have become standard and important, and also reveal a great deal, I think, about the emotional component of weddings today. And the first is the tea ceremony, which has a long, long history, although when I interviewed people about their earlier weddings, they did not have it. Is Marty still here? Yeah. So Marty did this fantastic survey in Chengdu in 1984? 87. And so maybe he will correct me. And that was the first material that I had that looked at what people did and how it varied by class and education of the bride and the groom and their own social background. The tea ceremony, for those of you who know it, is generally thought of at this, where the young couple serve tea to the parents in a ceremonial way expressing their respect, and then parents generally will give a gift, and then the next step is that the couple themselves feed each other sweet gruel. And this is, for many people, sort of marks the transition from being a son or daughter to being a son-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So the Gaiko Fei piece of this, which is how it's referred to in Shanghai now, is the idea that the parents are giving the young man and then the daughter. First you go to the bride's house, then to the groom's house. You're changing your term of address from the younger to the older. So instead of calling you auntie, I'm going to call you mother. Instead of calling you uncle, I'm going to call you father. And that's the Geico that's being then honored. But in fact, this ceremony now is a 3-hour or 4-hour event. I've attended them, I've observed them, and I've also seen videos of them, as well as asking people about them. And it is with the bridegroom first setting off firecrackers at his own home, driving to the bride's parents' home in a very expensive car, decorated rather like you might see certain kinds of wedding cars in the United States, but other countries also, with flowers and ribbons. Then there's a ceremony. The man calls out, let me in, let me in. He's not allowed to come in. Finally, he gives more money. He's allowed to come in. Then the bridesmaids taunt him. They make him do foolish things. They make him do push-ups. They make him eat foul food to prove his devotion to the bride. I went from, based on talking to people, they will say in Shanghai, this is something that must have come from the countryside. So it also gets to one of these other themes about this rural-urban split. Is it there, where it is, and what it means? I am still working on this, and I hope if there's anyone here who can help me better understand the roots of this, or different manifestations of these various steps that lead up to the tea ceremony itself, I would be grateful. But it does focus on the young couple, but it's done in the parents' house. In this picture, the parents are sitting in the outer room, and in the inner room is the bride sitting on the bed, the husband, the to-be, kneeling down, and her friends who have been taunting him standing while he pulls out a bouquet which has been given to him. He kneels and says he loves her. He doesn't say, may I marry you? He says he loves her. Then they move out into the other room where they will do the tea ceremony. They will present cups of tea to the parents. The parents will give them money. They will then drink the sweet tea, and then they leave, going in the cars to his parents, and they repeat the ceremony. One sidebar, last week when I was in Hong Kong, I stayed in the hotel, the Hyatt Hotel, at near the Chinese University, which is near the railroad station. Maybe it's a 4-star hotel. It's a very nice hotel, but it's not the most expensive hotel. And the first day I'm there, I see a wedding, and it was in the middle of the week, and I thought, that's interesting, and they were very elaborately dressed. And then I went down to breakfast, and I saw 2 more brides. And I looked out into the parking lot, and there were 5 cars. And I learned that in Hong Kong, the tea ceremony now is very important, but since the houses are too small, people rent a room in the hotel, and they carry out this in this ceremony, including the suckling pig in the Hyatt, and then going down in the elevator, I was surrounded by, 12 or 13 older relatives who had just been through the tea ceremony, going down in the elevator, and then they were moving on. This is something I didn't pay a lot of attention to. I now pay a lot of attention to. And what I'm particularly interested in is the relationship among the 6 principals, the husband and the wife and the in-laws. And I'm interested in looking at how new rituals have been adopted to help people negotiate these very fraught transitions in the life course. The other one that I've spent time looking at and working on is this exchange of wedding rings. This is a picture of it by the Hong Kong jewelry, but this is from Shanghai, with a young man choosing the rings. I also did observations, watching who bought the rings and role of parents, et cetera, et cetera. But the point was that wedding bands seem to have become, not the diamond ring, that's another story, incredibly important. Well, then I followed up and asked people, do they wear their rings? No, they don't wear their rings. And then I do the observations every day I'm on the subway. No, people are, who's wearing a ring, who's not wearing a ring, males versus females. These rings are really important, and they tell another story. I'm following who buys them, where they buy them, and then, this was the biggest surprise, the vows that are exchanged at when the rings are exchanged. And the first one is actually not when when the rings are exchanged, but these are vows that are now the standard vow that every couple that registers their wedding in Yangpu district of Shanghai has done for the last year. So in English, from this day forward, we will jointly assume the responsibilities and duties that marriage gives us. That's very close to the old Minzhangju. Be filial to parents and educate our children, show mutual respect and mutual love, mutual trust and mutual encouragement, mutual understanding, mutual forgiveness. Help each other when both are in humble circumstances, and be in love for the rest of our lives. From this day forward, regardless of whatever adversities in wealth and in poverty, in health and in sickness, in our youth and old age, we will share the same boat through wind and rain, suffering difficulties together and sharing both the sweet and the bitter. We become lifelong partners. This is a language which is not the usual state language. There are also, and when you look at the MC, there seems to resonate with in richer and poorer, in sickness and health, which many people think of as particularly a Christian phrase from the Book of Common Prayer. So this really caught everyone by surprise when I discovered it, and then I shared it. And I found that nobody who was married before 2005 had ever exchanged such vows. They couldn't imagine where these vows had come from. And in the work that I'm doing, obviously I'm pursuing this in much greater length, and this week we'll be doing some more things in Shanghai to pursue this, looking at variation by gender, class, and generation. But I present it here and in the paper. My main point is that what we see, and here it probably fits with the other papers, you can see where we're coming together, that this addition, first the standardized rituals that we ran through, and then the addition of these two highly choreographed rituals that people perform in front of large groups with a standard script, does many important things which do relate to happiness. And the first is that it generates intimate relations. This specifically is a phrase used by Ka-Ming Wu in her recent book about North China villagers. But I would say that this is very similar, is that by bringing people together in these intense moments where they are repeating a script created by others in front of others, enacting new roles, they actually generate a new intimacy. The second builds, as did Becky's, on this fantastic work by Adam Seligman and Rob Weller, who's here, which is how ritual allows you to get beyond agreeing on the meaning of what you're doing, so that you can go through it and you're performing acceptance. And this is part of why ritual is important, why it's sustained. And then this also is something others have talked about. This came from a reading by Joel Robbins, who is a colleague of Dick's, and his work was on 400 villagers on a small island in the Pacific, but he generalizes more generally that when you perform these rituals together in these highly intense environments, you have this kind of collective effervescence, this moment of joy, in this case, that allows you to transcend some of the anxiety, fears, even antipathies, and brings you further along in the relationship that you are trying to build. And then this is building on Becky's work, which is these kinds of rituals can create a narrative life as it ought to be. And in the case of the video age in which these weddings are occurring now, people have access to this day in which they relive it and they share it. So that in my interview, I have a standard interview that I give. There are 18 core questions that everybody gets, and then whatever else they want to say. I ask about the video. I ask whether it was videoed. I ask whether they look at the video again. And most people at that point ask me if I want to see the video, and of course I do want to see the video. So this idea that the wedding ritual, as it's being managed by other people in a very commercial way, has these implications for creating happiness, whether as an emotional status, is very, very powerful. In closing, I'll just return to some of the things that others have emphasized, which is, excuse me, what might be the Confucian part of this. And here I'm quoting from Dick's essay in Beyond the Clash of Civilizations. So in this, Dick is contrasting a Confucian and Christian, or that's the main piece, if I understand the essay. But he's then saying, if one practices Li and cultivates the virtue of Ren, one will produce things that are Shan. And the experience of this goodness will bring surpassing joy to a person morally cultivated enough to appreciate it. Goodness represents an ultimately valuable quality of life, yet this quality does not become the sacred foundation of a moral community. It is rather the byproduct of a way of life in which fundamentally social human beings practice 1, rituals of deference, 2, differentiation of social roles, and mutual support, that makes a harmonious society possible. And I put that in the PPT here and build on it in the paper because I think it's true. I mean, I think that I'm not going to make an argument that there's not a really important and also self-understood understanding of a Chinese Confucian tradition as people are adding these rituals and experiencing these rituals. But the final takeaway in the paper, and this is just making a general quick conclusion, which perhaps we will take further in discussion, is that I think the socialist piece, something that Jay just mentioned, that 50 years of CCP education, which has a very powerful moral, ethical piece, also did, maybe incompletely, create a kind of acceptance of bilateral kinship. And then the one-child policy has cemented it for these urban families. So a big piece of what I am seeing and what I'm seeing as the tensions and ambiguities in the wedding experience and the way and the rituals that have been adopted is because that the socialist piece of arguing for gender equality and bilaterality and the reality of the one-child policy, which in this urban case means 60 or 70% of these marriages are two singletons, brings a tension and also pressure on the wedding that was not there before. And then the third piece that's happening, which is going off in another direction, is like Yan Yunxiang. I really do think that there is a very, very strong embrace of individualism and of individual privacy and individual rights. So that in the work I did on divorce, where I did the law, the legal part, the interviews, and the focus groups, what I found was, and the courts themselves, there is really a very, very strong protection in contrary to whoever's been arrested. I'm not denying that, but in the area of personal life, in the area of family life, the Chinese state has stepped way, way back, and the idea that individuals have this right to privacy and the right to their personal happiness is a very, very powerful current shaping contemporary life in urban China. Okay.